In this lesson, we're going to spend some time talking about political apathy and the extent to which there is a participation crisis in the UK's democratic process. Generally speaking, we're talking a little bit about the different patterns of participation as well as the different forms of participation in the UK's political system. And this is often a question that you will be asked in an exam. To the extent to which there is political apathy, the extent to which there is a participation crisis, etc., etc., etc. And in fact, over 10 years ago, when I first started my A-level in politics, the first essay question that my teacher actually set as homework was something about to what extent is there political apathy in the UK. I didn't do very well in that essay, fundamentally. I think I only got like a D or an E. I did improve, thank you very much. But other than that, this is an indication of just how old and how well this question always plays when we look at exams and when we look at the sort of to's and fro's against whether or not this is an answer that we can actually come to a conclusion for. So we're going to be talking in this lesson about whether or not there is indeed a participation crisis in the UK. We'll be citing lots of pieces of evidence. We'll be citing a few of the main cases that you can really examine in relation to this question. And we will not necessarily come to a conclusion, but we should give you enough information and give you enough insight into how you might approach this kind of question for if you do get set this question in an exam or a mock exam or as homework. So beginning first then, your introduction to an essay question about political participation would probably begin by referring to what it means to have political participation, what political participation means, and what does a, quote, political participation crisis refer to. And generally speaking, in the UK, it refers to general concerns about the declining levels of engagement, usually rendered in the kind of traditional forms of political participation. And this is seen in terms of voting, in terms of party memberships, and in terms of on-the-ground activism. These are considered to be the sort of traditional forms of political participation. And one of the counter-arguments that you can levy against the idea that there is a participation crisis in the UK is that while there has been a decline in the traditional forms of political participation, there has been an increase in more novel and more modern approaches to political participation. So, for example, engaging in social media, engaging with politicians on social media. That is one of the main methods by which political participation takes place now. People just sharing political stories on their social media or talking about politics on their social media. So you could make automatically a counter argument to this question by talking about the extent to which there hasn't been a decline necessarily in political participation, but there has been a change in the ways in which people participate. So this lesson is going to go into this in more detail, examine the arguments for and against the idea that there is this kind of participation crisis. And generally speaking, every single student will begin by talking about voter turnout as a piece of evidence for or against participation. Generally speaking, while UK general elections have had varied turnouts, there has been a noticeable decline over the last few decades. So, for example, turnout fell from 71.3% in 1997 to 65.1% in 2010. These figures seem to have stabilized since then, seem to have flattened out and sort of plateaued, with turnout ranging from 66 to 68% in recent elections. The 2024 election that has just happened a couple of months ago, while the turnout voter data isn't completely determined at the time of recording, it is estimated by the public policy research think tank that the turnout was actually around 52%, a very, very poor result for a general election, especially a general election of this nature, a general election that essentially overthrew a sitting government that existed, or a party that was in government for 14 years. Now, there might be a few reasons why the election of 2024 had low turnout. One includes the fact that it was pretty clear from the outset, from the get-go, that the Labour Party, that Keir Starmer's Labour Party, was always going to win this election. The question wasn't whether or not they were going to win. The question was by how much were they going to win? And so that might increase apathy because people might think, well, there's no point going out to vote because we know who's going to win. If I'm a Labour supporter, for example, I might say, well, I don't necessarily even have to go out and vote because I know that my party is going to get into office. In addition to this, there has been there's sort of the general apathy that exists as the result of so many years of distrust in the government. So obviously there was a lot of apathy towards the Conservative government, given the fact that they lost quite significantly in this election. But there was also quite a lot of apathy in the Labour government as well. People weren't that excited about Labour. They weren't that excited about Sir Keir Starmer's Labour government. A lot of people, especially as you go more and more to the left of the Labour government, are critical of Sir Keir Starmer in relation to, for example, the previous leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And there is obviously that divide that still is and permeates in the Labour Party. In fact, a divide that has been exacerbated even more so ever since the recent hotting up of conflict and armed conflict in Israel and Palestine, which of course is a very divisive political issue for those people who are on the left of politics. So these are some of the reasons why there might have been low turnout in this election. Turnout in local elections and other non-general elections are significantly lower as well, reflecting broader disengagement with local governance. You'll see examples of somewhere between 20, 30, maybe a push 40% turnout in some of these elections that are very local in nature. In addition to poor turnout, party membership has seen a major decline over the last few years. For instance, the Labour and Conservative Party had hundreds of thousands of members in the mid-20th century, now have significantly fewer. For example, in 2018, the Conservative Party had just 124,000 members. And this reflects, again, a broader shift in the ways in which people engage in politics. They tend not to engage in politics anymore through the membership and local level grassroots recruitment of people at and in and around political parties. They instead tend to use different forms of participation as methods for being able to engage in political activism. Younger generations are, in particularly, less likely to join political parties than previous generations, suggesting that this will be a decline that will continue so long as that statistic continues. Other kinds of political activism has also seen a decline. So, for example, party-driven campaigns. This is often offset by the rise in some issue-based activism and grassroots movement, often, as noted as well, that I mentioned already, facilitated through social media. Many people now engage with politics through social media, through petitions, through informal online platforms, and rather than any kind of traditional activism and traditional party politics. Things like, for example, protests tend to be more popular these days than joining political parties, for example. An example that has happened literally just last night at the time of recording. I'm recording this on the 8th of August 2024, but there was a quite significant anti-far-right protest that drowned out quite a lot of the far-right fascist adjacent riots that had been taking place over the week prior. So for those of you who are going to be watching this lesson when it comes out in September, October time, you will remember back to the riots that took place in August of 2024. These riots were drowned out by quite a lot of anti-racist political activists and anti-racist political protests, showing that there is still quite a significant amount of political activism, but just not in the traditional ways. And so these new forms of participation have given rise to what can be described as digital platforms and digital engagement. digital political engagement. These include online petitions, social media activism, digital lobbying. For example, the Revoke Article 50 and Remain in the EU petition on the Parliament website got 6.1 million signatures. Notice here that the e-petition system is a very, very interesting way for people to engage directly with what they believe to be political change and to petition the Parliament directly through electronic means and methods. Grassroots movements and community-based activism is also becoming more prominent. There is a lot of demonstrations, traditional forms of participation, alternative methods of engagement, all taking place. Just this year, we've seen this in the form of the Just Stop Oil protests, as well as the Free Palestine protests. Again, both are two movements that were significant and have been significant in terms of their activism.